Right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our May Science Education Department seminar series. It is our last seminar for the spring semester. Today, it is our distinct pleasure to welcome Kate Penner, who is the undergraduate science research advisor working in the Office of Science Education within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. She's an educator and the STEM student support practitioner at Harvard College. And her research and work is focused on helping students navigate the STEM landscape from a wide range of backgrounds. Her professional trajectory has been deeply impacted by her own transition stories. Graduated from a public high school in Virginia, Kate got into a first-year STEM program at Harvard College, and it resulted her receiving an undergraduate degree in government in 2007. And then she returned to STEM, or more specifically, she returned to the mathematics undergraduate. Yeah, and then after, for almost 10 years, she taught in the math department, teaching all flavors of calculus and linear algebra, and was recognized over 20 times for excellence in teaching undergraduate mathematics. So while Kate was the STEM academic coach for the university's Academic Resource Center, she developed and launched support resources for STEM students, designed a supplementary instructional pilot in partnership with the math department, and she was a pilot co-designer and coach for academic probation student support. So today, in her role as the undergraduate science research advisor, she seeks to make academic research more accessible by helping students decode and navigate the university's research landscape as they begin to build their identities as scientists. And our topic today is boosting, as Kate showed on the screen, boosting STEM persistent student identity formation in the transition from high school to college. And in this talk, Kate will discuss some of the major barriers to STEM persistence, a focal point of equity and access in higher ed in multiple contexts. Why is the high school to college STEM transition so challenging? And how can extracurricular engagement in academic research transform the student experience, and so on. Okay, so without further ado, let's formally welcome our speaker today, Kate Penner. And welcome, Kate. And I will turn the presentation over to you. And people feel free to have your questions in the chat or raise your hand as we go. Thank you, Kate. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I really appreciate being invited to speak here. This is really, this is what I'm pretty much like at dinner parties. This is what I speak about all the time to anyone who will listen. So to be invited to be part of this speaker series was just so exciting to see that invitation. I want to thank Cynthia and the entire team for bringing me here. And my position is very, I think, unique in the landscape because I sit in student support. I also sit on the instructional side. And so my background and my pathway to what I study and how I came to study it, I think are sort of a little bit merging, intersectional between lots of different aspects of both science education, extracurricular student support, but also college student development. So I'm just so thrilled to be able to speak with you all, especially with people who are working with students, who are thinking about programs and program structure, and the opportunity to share some of what I've seen has been, I'm thrilled to be here today. All right, who am I? My name is Kate Penner. I take she, hers pronouns, and as it was recently just said, I'm a STEM student support practitioner and educator at Harvard College. So my current position is as the undergraduate science research advisor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences Office of Science Education. And what I do in that position is I try to help students learn about the science research landscape for them, their experience and what's happening in their lives on a day-to-day basis. The limit of that is pretty much the courses that they're in, what they've signed up for, what labs they have, what homework they have. And the notion of research, there are some research-based courses within their departments, but they do not necessarily know about the extent of their departmental offerings. They don't necessarily know what research is. Not all of them do. And certainly within academia, there is a high incidence of folks going into academic research who have parents who are academic researchers. And so one of the most important things that I find myself doing is trying to reach beyond that audience and trying to orient and explain to folks where they are sitting within this vast institution, trying to show them what opportunities are available to them that really make especially Harvard College stand apart. But there are lots of institutions where academic research is happening, and help them develop the skills and the confidence in order to engage in that network. So finding researchers, reading through research papers that they may not fully understand, being able to communicate with a researcher to express their interest, and presenting themselves with their best foot forward in order to get involved in research. My work, however, has ranged across lots of different points of entry to the student experience. I've loved problem solving from when I was a very young child. So the problem that I think as an adult, I've decided to professionally devote myself to has been how to get more students to stay in math and science who are interested in doing that. And so I've been taking a look at this problem over the last 15 years and really thinking about it from different angles. The longest position that I held was as a member of the teaching faculty in the math department. And for me, that was a seminal experience where I was really observing for the first time how many students were having similar first-year experiences, second-year experiences of reorienting themselves to college math and science. I found that many aspects of their struggle and what they found most difficult were common across lots of student experiences, that there were things that we could be doing as teachers, as faculty members, as instructors, as practitioners. I worked within a program in the math department called the Emerging Scholars Program, which currently is a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, but in its first launch, it was a social academic enrichment program designed for students who had relatively limited mathematics exposure who wanted to go into any STEM field. We had small cohorts where we worked with students intimately, and that shaped a great deal of my understanding of how the university can be experienced so differently across such a varied incoming class of students. And from there, I went to the Academic Resource Center, as was mentioned, where I produced a great deal of support resources for students across math and science, whether they are at a relatively advanced incoming position as they're looking to take first-year coursework, or whether they've always felt that they've struggled in mathematics. Those support resources were designed for a wide range of students, and all of those sort of come together into the work that I do now. So to look at what I'm going to put forward today, I've already introduced myself, but what I'm going to first talk about are some of the challenges of the current research as a practitioner. I'm going to transition then into a first case study, which will segue into what's really happening when it comes to STEM persistence and a framework for successful persistence from the vantage point of a practitioner or someone who is really involved with students on a day-to-day basis. We're then going to talk about what the roles of coursework and research are within that framework. Where can they be to leverage different aspects of the student experience and hopefully improve student persistence? That then really hands off nicely to how research, in fact, really amplifies identity formation. And then at the end, I'll close with some closing thoughts, some questions, and certainly some next steps as far as what I'm looking at. And I do want to say that throughout all of this, even though we have time for questions at the end, I want to encourage people to ask questions throughout. All right, so the first thing is the challenges of applying current research to practice. a lot of the time when we're looking at research and as a practitioner, oh, great, thank you so much for that message in the chat. A lot of the time as a researcher or people are writing from a very specific vantage point. And when I was first starting off as someone who is on the practice side of things, meaning I was working with students, whether I was teaching them or advising them, I've spent many years as a student advisor. It was very hard for me because at first I felt like, okay, you know what? All I need to do is write down correct mathematics very cleanly on the board, and then everything else will take care of itself. And quite quickly, I realized that that was absolutely not the case. There was a lot happening within each of my courses. And even though, yes, my board work was clean and my mathematics was correct, within a group of students, there were lots of people experiencing what I was doing very, very differently from each other. And so what I started doing almost immediately was reaching to research to try to apply research to my practice. And one of the things that I really struggled with was first specificity. Research was often incredibly specific, which is absolutely appropriate for their conclusions. But what people were talking about was within a particular setting, within a particular set of students, within a particular course, within a particular unit. This is what we did, and this is what happened. And I felt very limited by trying to take something that someone had crafted in a very different setting and try to just apply it to what I was doing. The second challenge that I saw was really perspective. Many of the researchers positioned themselves as observers, where they were talking about departmental or institutional level interventions. And I was an individual instructor, sometimes standing in front of a room of 150 people, which is not a small number of people, but certainly not someone who's looking to apply an institutional level intervention to a room of 150 people. So my perspective was very, very different from what I was encountering in the literature. Much of the teaching focused literature was focused on tools of teaching or teaching moves. If you teach in this way or build an assessment in this way, here is what happens in a randomized controlled trial. And those are also very context specific. That's my fourth bullet, that lacks in context. It was appropriate for a particular course with a particular topic in a particular unit. So I was left with this big question. For folks who are in high touch positions, meaning that they are interacting with individual students and lots of them on a daily basis, like what options exist on the individual level and on the low structural level to increase STEM persistence? And by low structural, I mean, I'm not changing the structure of a department. I'm not changing the structure of a major. I'm looking at decisions that I can implement fairly easily without needing like a huge amount of coordination or process before implementing them. What can I do on a daily basis to try to increase STEM persistence? And so before we start talking about that, I want to be really clear about my specific position in terms of what STEM persistence means to me. So I've put together this timeline where there are very reductive 4 steps to STEM persistence, easy as pie. The first one is that we have an identified goal. A student develops a desire for further study in a STEM field or to pursue a career in a STEM field. A lot of this goal identification, a lot of their identity formation occurs before they even arrive at college. It can often shape which colleges they're applying to, which programs they're most interested in, how they package themselves for college. The college application and admissions process also has lots of different dynamics happening within it, and they are admitted and select an institution. That leads them to step 2, where they begin their journey. The student begins their course of study in that college or university. And really for the first time, they are often in cohorts of similarly interested students that share their goals. Now, this is not everyone. There are certainly folks who go to magnet high schools where it is sort of assembled around a unifying academic interest. But for a lot of people, the folks who were sitting next to them in chemistry class or biology class or physics class were often people who were taking that because it was a requirement to graduate from high school. And now socially, These students are sitting in classrooms next to people who have the same professional goals as them, who have the same often academic achievements as them. And there's a new peer-to-peer dynamic that starts to happen. The third step is that the student commits to a major. They identify their specific direction of study, and then they continue to fill the coursework requirements that go along with that major. And then the last step is graduation. The student successfully graduates having completed their degree requirements, and they receive their desired degree. And so where I'm sitting, which is first as an instructor, as a faculty member, I was often teaching in first-year courses. At the college, as well as at several universities, there are a wide range of courses that first years could end up in depending on their high school experience. But as you're standing there teaching whatever flavor of, math, pre-calculus, calculus, linear algebra, depending on the situation, earlier interventions are the most formative. Often the most fraught moments for STEM persistence are very early on in a student's experience. So this area that I've highlighted on this slide is really going to be the focus of the case studies that I'm presenting, the focus of this discussion in terms of where research can really do a great deal of benefit. And I often think when people are using the metaphor of a STEM pipeline, we're talking about not waiting until we're way far down the pipeline to implement interventions. We're really thinking about that space between where the journey begins and a major is declared. Now, there are lots of institutions where actually they declare a major at the very, very beginning, but there are others where there's a bit of a gap. And in either case, what we're really looking at is those early semesters where students are sort of assimilating to a new community, to a new institution, and how does science fit into how they think about themselves and what they commit to continuing to study. Oh, there we go. And so what's challenging, as I mentioned about the research, is that the perspective is often from an institutional level rather than sort of a personal one. And it was very difficult for me because I would read these papers that were often talking about numbers and passing rates and what's the exam performance? What's the persistence numbers? But I don't walk around on a day-to-day basis interacting with numbers. I walk around on a day-to-day basis interacting with students. I interact with people. So case studies were always a way in for me to really talk about what was most effective and to understand what was most effective as well. So I've featured a handful of these. So we're going to embark on our first one here. This is the case study of a first-year student. This was an incoming student interested in one of the physical sciences. She had a strong positive association with the field and other high school math and science experiences. And so when she initially came in, the content that she experienced in her course load, which she took a fairly typical for her institution, math and science course load, 1 chemistry course, 1 math course, 2 other courses that were satisfying other requirements. Initially, she described the content as understandable in the opening weeks of the semester. She identified herself as a strong student in high school, having performed well compared to her peers. As she continued into the semester, she noticed that there was an impression growing of disconnection between the assignments she was doing and various components of the courses that she was in. She described her lab, lecture, and homework assignments feeling as if they came from 3 different courses. And it became increasingly difficult for her to understand what she was supposed to know in her classes. While she had study strategies that had proved very effective in high school, the application of those study strategies had entirely different results in college. She found herself staying up very, very late at night, losing sleep, very common experience within the first year fall. And then when she sat down to take exams, she found that that impression of disconnection and incoherence increased. Her experience of examinations was that the material was not what she had been taught. As she moved to the spring, she was very excited because she was taking her first course in what her major field would be. And though this course was traditionally with a lab component, that particular semester it was lacking a lab component. She noticed that she had no personal connection, not like social personal, but literal interaction with faculty in her courses. And she reported a disconnect between assignments and assessments to be growing. There were common phrases being used across her STEM faculty of students sinking or swimming, and that being the common culture within these courses. She often felt that her learning was not well supported, though she did as many problems as was given to her. She felt still that she went into exams lacking in the understanding necessary to be successful. This student was then declaring their major at the end of these 2 semesters. And after assessing the coming requirements, the student decided not to continue and declared a non-STEM field major, had not taken any courses in that field when they declared their major. Some notable points about this student's experience was that on paper, this student's grades did not warrant, in the mind of their advisors, as well as their faculty members, further conversation. Their grades were, so to speak, not so poor that there was great concern about their ability to continue within their program. And so this decision to leave their STEM field, despite being enthusiastic at the start of the year, was an entirely private one, completely internal, without consultation with friends or peers, despite the fact that the student did have a study group. And so it was very anonymous, and with the institutional structure in place, the individuals, the residential advisor, the academic advisor, the student said, no, I do not think anybody knew about my decision-making process. And while this is an individual case study, the 3 cases that I've presented are ones that are represented across dozens, if not hundreds, of student experiences that I've interacted with over the years. So the big question here really is, what happened? What happened? There are sort of big 3 themes that I like to point to because they offer us levers as either teaching faculty or folks who can bring people on in a research capacity as far as things we can change. One is isolation. The student transitioned to a new academic environment and experiences isolation for the first time. Some of that is normal in the sense that they don't know anyone in this new environment. They don't know any of the classes. They don't know any of the landscape very well, but they're just trying to plug through it. And there's a breakdown in the ability to connect with that student. And so as that student was describing, I made this decision entirely on my own. I didn't know or think to consult with someone else. That isolation absolutely is a major component of that. The second theme is preparation. And I put this in quotes because I don't love the framing of the word preparation in research, because it seems to put the entire responsibility, agency, and onus on the student to understand and fix their preparation levels. The other thing is that preparation is often used to describe content-specific issues, that the student comes in with holes in their understanding that are prerequisite for a certain course that they're in. This student did not experience content holes as much as her learning methods and study strategies from her K-12 experience, where she had 1-hour-long classes 5 times a week. They worked in that situation, but as she moved to college, they were really insufficient in the face of increased volume, where the student was in class once a week, 3 times a week for an hour as well as the rapid pacing of the courses. But there was no discussion or conversation within her classes about this transition, about how to update her methods. And so she was left with just internal narratives about how to make sense of what was happening to her. And this is true of all of us when we come into an institution or situation or a job, we have pre-made scripts and narratives that allow us to understand and make sense of what's happening in our lives. And for this student, those pre-made scripts and narratives about how her first year should be going, how she should be doing in her math and science courses in order to continue into those fields, all combined to tell that student that the right decision was to leave the field. And you might wonder, like, how do you know so much about that student? Well, the student is me. This was my first year experience. I declared a concentration in or major in government, not having taken a single gov class. I was not on academic probation. On paper, I did not register as someone who desperately needed an urgent conversation about needing help in their classes or needing support in their classes. And yet all these things came together that led to me thinking, I am making a reasonable decision. What was the narrative that was in my head? It's influenced by film and television, but also about how other adults talk about their progress in math and science. I only could make it so far in math before none of it made sense, and then I had to quit. Calculus never made sense to me, is what some adults would say. And so for a long time, I was developing this sense of the world as I am to choose a field of study. What that should feel like is that I'm successful, is that I'm capable. And when it stops feeling that way, no one has given me an example of continuing. And so when it stops feeling that way, I should probably make a graceful exit. And this case study, which I've shared with, it's actually how I open the semester when I teach math, offers a way in to talk to students about their own experience. Especially if I'm in the spring semester, I say, how many of you can identify with some piece of this story? And I don't think I've seen a room where like there's a single hand that's not raised. When we think about how students decide what to study, meaning they've come into college, even in high school, and then it sort of like replicates itself, it repeats itself when there's an additional declaration of major. There are sort of four big components that go into this. One is their interest level, the degree to which they're interested in the subject, right? Two is their skill level. What is the skill level that I've reached through my studies so far? Third is their talent, which is the degree to which they believe they have an inclination towards the field. And for a lot of students, that is not, the talent piece is not something they perceive that they've had to work very hard for. Oh, I've always been told I was a math person. I've been told that this comes easily to me, is often some of the phrasing that they'll articulate about this. And potential, the degree to which the student believes they can achieve in the future. Now, I want to be really clear that these four things are extraordinarily subjective. And when I'm talking about how they decide what to study, all four of these, interest, skill, talent, potential, they are self-perceived. It's about how much interest does the student feel like they have right now? How much skill does the student feel like? And by the way, all of these also can have external factors that affect our self-perception. I'm comparing to my peers. Between the day before college starts and the day college starts, my own perception of my skill might change wildly. So not only are they self-perceived, two, they are very influenced by external factors, which means they are really not fixed. Even within the same student, the same course, the same semester, these can wildly sort of like oscillate up and down, depending on the day, depending on the event. You can probably imagine a couple of events that influence students' self-perception of their skill, things like midterm exams, homework assignments, stuff like that. What's very interesting is that as faculty, we might have a very different answer to the question of how should students decide what to study. As a faculty member, talent is way less significant to me and my students than their interest and their potential and their skill and their attitude. I might even sub in something else. But what is very difficult is that for students who are new to the institution, new to studying these fields at the higher education level, these tend to be the big four when I ask someone, how did you decide? They usually will name these. So what happens as a student goes through their first year? A framework for successful persistence, there are actually a lot of them out there, but one of the most useful ones that I use in my work is based off of this thing called the W curve. It was initially developed in order to describe the cultural experience of a student who's studying abroad. That there's this honeymoon period where you're super enthusiastic. There's a crash as you experience initial culture shock. There's a modest initial adjustment, then another crash as you experience mental isolation, and then an increase, sort of an upswing to a much stabler acceptance and integration into the new community. Now, what's interesting is that in the early 90s, people said, yes, this is a great model for someone moving outside of their home country, but this is also replicated within the first year college experience. And so often when I'm watching people move through fall semester, spring semester, through academic experiences, through social experiences, the big question is, how does their self-assessment of their interest, their skill, their talent, their potential change, wax and wane as they move through this W curve? What are the major shocks for them? What are the boosts for them? Where are there possible inroads where we can try to buffer and protect things? And as we think about as they're self-assessing that interest and skill and talent and potential, really what we're talking about is their academic identity of being a science student, being a STEM major, eventually moving on into potentially a professional science career. And so the big question is, what levers do we have at our disposal to bolster this, to grow it, to make it extremely resistant to these shocks that are absolutely going to happen across the first year experience? So this is where, the two big things are coursework, and of course the topic and my focus professionally is research in this role. And like every single student, just by construction, by being a college student, they're engaged in coursework. So that's one inroad. But research is often a very untapped opportunity for these early year students. And the big thing that stands out to us in the landscape is that if coursework and research can increase students' self-perceptions or buffer them from the shocks of traveling along this W curve in their first year, they will increase the likelihood that students will persist in STEM. Now, when we're talking about academic identity, I do want to sort of pause and define that a little bit more clearly. There are lots of multiple dimensions of identity that reflect the different groups that we consider ourselves belonging to. So for this purposes of this talk, what I'm talking about is scientific identity. The degree to which a person feels a part of the community surrounding their academic path. This can manifest for different students in wildly different ways. Do I feel comfortable going to the classes that are part of my current planned major? Do I feel comfortable voicing my confusion in spaces that are built to do that, like office hours or a study group? Do I feel like I can rely on others for help? Do I feel like I agree with the statement that I am a scientist, or I can be successful in my courses, or I am interested in continuing to study X field? The resources of my department are there for me to use. I am excited by the research questions of my field. There are lots of different ways to sort of encapsulate what we talk about when we mean scientific identity. Doesn't have to be the same for every person, but it certainly is the degree to which they feel at home within their department, similar to other people on some metric within their field, within their incoming class. And it's really also important to notice that identity does not start from zero at first year. People come in with various aspects of their identity being very important or less so. Major influences can include their family. There's often a lot of family pressure, especially in the sciences, community, and high school experience. And over the course of college, everyone is really more broadly trying to figure out, who am I? What do I value? Things like that. But even within an academic context, the same thing is playing out. One of the most helpful models that I use in practice with students is the model of multiple dimensions of identity. I put a graphic of it down here at the bottom. The exercise to do is to think to yourself, what are 6 descriptors that answer the question, who am I? And each of these orbits represents one of those descriptors. I might say, I'm a woman. I'm a math educator. I'd like to think I'm funny, but I haven't told very many jokes in this talk. So you'll have to just believe me or something. I'm an artist. And so I would assign each of these descriptors, and perhaps my race, I'm a mixed race Black woman. I would assign each orbit to a descriptor, and then I would place the core there at the center is me. And I would place on that orbit either close to the core or far away how tightly that identity matters. And so what's interesting is, depending on the spaces that I'm in, depending on the people that I'm talking to, the events that I'm going to, when I walk into a math class that I'm about to teach, math educator swoops in very tightly on that orbit. And when I'm out with I'm also a professional dancer. When I'm out with my dance friends, we don't talk about math, although that's changing because one of them is taking calculus too. So the awareness that we have is that these ideas and notions of identity are sometimes tightly held, are sometimes loosely held, and they are changing day to day, week to week. And one of the challenges to think about as we're talking about STEM persistence is there's going to be an orbit that is STEM student or scientist. And it's okay if that identity briefly flings away from the center, but the issue is that it can't stay there. We can't have students, unless they authentically are interested in other things. I do want to be clear that I'm not going to force anyone to be a scientist who doesn't want to be a scientist. But for those who come in with an authentic interest about being a scientist and studying science, there are going to be natural elements of that W curve that we just saw that are going to swing that identity far away from who we feel like we are. And the key is for those moments to try to be minimized, to bring them back into the center when we can. And as much as those intersecting orbits are very nice to look at, I often try to reduce this into a much simpler idea for myself and my practice. One is just respecting the fact that people have a lot of different ways to make sense of themselves. There are a lot of orbits that I don't know what is most important to them, and I'm interested to learn. But that there's sort of a horizon out there where I don't want I am a scientist to swing beyond that and stay there for a long period of time. So when I'm visualizing this, I think of, the student is at the core. The various concentric circles are elements of their identity. They might come in close, they might swing out far, but the green one that I've highlighted there is the example of when we move beyond that, the student is feeling really disconnected from the field, from their future study in the field. It might be a reflection of their self-perception changing. My potential is waning. My sense of my own potential is waning. My sense of my ability and skill is waning. And my key as I'm working with students is to try to see those moments where we sort of swing past that green horizon, and I want to bring them back in. I want to bring it back to the inside, closer to the core. And in this way, I want to present a couple of case studies where two very different experiences were happening that are exceedingly common. One is very, very current. This is Kara. She's a student interested in a physical science or engineering field. She had strong positive association with the field and other high school math and science experiences. You'll notice this is quite fresh as far as a case study because her first year was our remote year. She had to participate in all of her first year courses remotely. This profoundly limited her sense of entering community of any kind. But Kara was very, very cognizant of this, which was great. She knew that what she was experiencing was not what college was normally like. And she felt like she didn't want to make any major changes based off of how she was feeling in her first year. Her second year, she declares her major. She does declare her major in the physical science / engineering field, but that major requires a huge array of prerequisites that are outside the department, which makes her feel like she's delaying the start to really studying her major. Whereas her friends who are in the humanities, who are in the social sciences, are talking about the faculty members in their department, are talking about the courses they're taking in her department. And Kara is in this position that's really common within a lot of the sciences where there's an enormous amount of courses that are absolutely counting towards her major, but they're not within the department that she has declared her major in. She tries to repair this by taking advantage of events and programming. And one of the nice things actually that happened at the end of Kara's second year was that one of her professors, even though it was in a field outside of her major, offered her the opportunity to do even 3 weeks of research in her lab before going on a summer study abroad. And Kara was very excited about that. She really appreciated the opportunity and felt enthusiastic about that, engaged in it. But in the back of Kara's mind the whole time, she said, you know, this is not really my major. She was toying with switching her major into that science. So that would not have been a departure in terms of leaving STEM. In her third year, Kara is reporting this growing sense of disengagement. She's received sort of like the most amount of community in many of the courses that are outside of science. She's only in the single digits of courses that are within her department because now she's really starting in earnest studying within her department. But through a friend network, she's connected to a research experience in her specific area of interest within her major field. And her area of interest does not have any undergraduate opportunities in her department for coursework. It's more of a graduate coursework topic, and she does not have the prerequisites in order to take that course. She is thrilled by this. When I met up with Kara to talk to her about this, some of the things that she self-reported is that this sense of being disconnected, she was constantly toying with, should I continue in my major? I've done so few courses in it. I don't know if this is the right fit. I've developed another interest outside of STEM. I don't know what to do. I feel very adrift. This research experience has given her a renewed interest in her major field. She reports the project that she works on with a great deal of personal pride and ownership. She considers it a really creative, novel pursuit. She's part of a new community that she considers very elite. It's within one of the research institutes affiliated with the university. And she describes her feeling as being in the right place academically. And even though she is still working through some of her prerequisites for advanced study within her major, one of the interesting things is that her community within this research group and lab has offered her support in her coursework. This feeling of being adrift, of saying, you know, I'm taking this class, but it's not really for my major, it's not that relevant to what I want to study, was immediately addressed by her research mentor, who said, well, let me take a look at it. Oh, wow, I use this all the time, and proceeded to show Kara direct application of what she was studying in another department within their research group. That community of people who can support advising and skill development has been really critical for Kara, who said that without this conversation with her research mentor, I felt like this course was going to be really difficult, that I would have waning interest. And it wasn't until he showed me how relevant it was that this door opened to me. And it maintained her enthusiasm and engagement. So research, yep, go ahead.
Sorry, just a quick question that actually relates right to that in the chat is, what about gender differences in that disengagement?
I think that's very interesting too. What I've seen especially is that the undergraduate community within many of these fields that do have substantial gender disparities leave especially women and underrepresented groups not as well served by the student groups and by some of the activities that are affiliated with the department, and that really additional thought and outreach and connection are a major part of what would end up being a more successful intervention. Namely, that the pre-existing structures tend to support the continued engagement of the dominant groups within that department already. And it's not about titling something as being specifically designed for another population, because that can often be very, very challenging and honestly involves sort of like a vast oversimplification of what everyone's experiencing, but instead really thinking about what might be prohibiting, for instance, in this instance, Kara is a woman who is interested in a field that is predominantly men at this university. And so it's challenging for her to go to the major student group. She feels also very disconnected given her first year experience. She just feels like she got off on the wrong foot. And so this really intentional outreach where it's very personal, and often a research setting is the perfect place for that because you're not dealing with 50 people within the same research group. You have a research mentor who is checking in quite regularly. Really works very well for Kara to be able to be connected to the same resources and information and encouragement that someone else might be able to receive within a larger group setting within the department. Great question. I wanted to juxtapose this with Samuel, who is another student who came in interested in the life sciences with aspirations of attending medical school. He also had strong and positive association with the field. I always think it's important to say that because people will sometimes suggest, and it is absolutely reasonable to suggest, did this student have negative association with the field even in high school and brought that with them? So Samuel had strong positive association with math and science from high school. And he declared a major in the life sciences, but this is his story of going through his 4 years. In year one, he was often found himself in conversation with other students who were actively engaged in research. And he said, quote, "Everyone who was doing research seemed to already have experience. I wasn't aware of a pathway where no experience was required," end quote. And especially within that first year, as we're thinking about that W curve and people are trying to reach that stable level of acceptance that's happening, one of the most challenging feelings that so many students have is a sense of being behind their peers, of lacking in some particular component. And research was a big piece of that for Samuel. What he then realized was his information was faulty, but he felt he realized that too late. So throughout his first year, he doesn't attempt to get involved in a research experience because he's hearing from the loudest voices in the room that you already need experience in order to do research. I do assure you that today, talking to Samuel, he's aware that that's very circular reasoning, and that obviously people who have research experience at some point had no research experience. He's like very reflective about this. But at the time, he said, I quickly thought, you need experience in order to do this. I did not know how to get that. I did not know where to look. When I came in for sophomore fall, years 2 and 3, he quickly realized that there had actually been a summer that a huge number of people in his class had participated in that was to be their first research experience. Then he felt even worse. He was like, all these people just had this research experience. I didn't even know it existed. And so that's how sophomore year kicks off for him. And as time passes, he starts to solidify the notion that research was not for him. And it's a mix of circumstance, which is, I didn't get involved first year. I hear all these people are getting involved first year. I didn't get involved over the summer. All these people got involved over the summer. You know what? I'm not that into it. And he said, I convinced myself I was actually not interested in it as a means to reconcile this feeling that he was missing the on-ramps within his undergraduate experience. As he transitions, he is taking coursework. He is doing quite well in his science courses. He does want to embark on an undergraduate thesis, but without research experience, when he gets to the undergraduate thesis, the department does not really have supports in place for folks who do not have prior research experience to declare an undergraduate thesis. One of the requirements is to submit a proposal to the department. And a proposal is also going to require a lab, a PI who's willing to supervise, a research mentor who will shepherd the project along. Without prior experience, Samuel does not have that in place. While he's enthusiastic about the project, the department says we don't have anyone who's doing work like that. And so his undergraduate thesis proposal is not supported by his department. Samuel has multiple interests. One of them is in the humanities, and all along he's been taking a substantial amount of courses in this. Initially, he was hoping to do a joint major between the two, but when the department says there's no way to embark on an undergraduate thesis, he switches his major. So without research experience, when Samuel looks back on his 4 years, he notices that his self-perception was shifting without research experience, and specifically looking at his classmates and their research experience. His perceptions of his own skill were deeply affected. His perceptions of his potential were affected, and his perception of his own interest level was affected. Today in conversation, he says he's not sure whether those feelings were based in objective measures, but at the time he can say that he felt really stigmatized by his lack of research participation when it was so common in the discipline that he went into, but that he points to a lack of information around access as a major driver. He identifies and feels that he's someone that, given the information, he absolutely would have followed up on it, but he was just not made aware that this was a surmountable issue. So what are the levers that we have for persistence? As we're looking through these two case studies, a big piece of this, because I think one of the things that really stands out to me that's sort of surprising about Samuel is that despite these growing feelings of discontent, he is persisting. And that's certainly not the case across sort of like the whole body of students who are in STEM. If we're going to get information to Samuel or someone in Samuel's position, early information is key. Awareness of resources is key. It's not up to Samuel to know exactly how to do this. It's enough to tell him who to talk to. It's enough to tell him if you're interested in research, you could approach your lab TF at the end of section to ask, I'm kind of interested in research. How might I go about doing this? What skills have I learned in this lab section that I could put on a resume? Dissemination of information has become apparently my Everest, because so many people will say, well, we emailed it to them. And that is not what I mean. Like adding another email to an 18-year-old's inbox is like a way to not have your email read. We have to think really creatively about effective methods of dissemination of information. One of the most effective strategies is to put information in places where the students are already going, where the students are already consuming information. That could be course websites, weekly emails, announcing it in lecture, hosting events in the department that students already attend, where this is part of the conversation. If there are advising structures or steps that students need to follow in order to become a STEM major within a particular discipline, including an orientation that discusses this for every single student within those structures that already exist, that students are already engaged in. But I am super hesitant to like say, you know, we're going to add another email. The second thing is we want to find opportunities for interaction that are low stakes, that are fairly easy for faculty to implement and for students to engage in and do not feel supercharged. So I appreciate that folks have introduced a lot of sort of like collaborative projects, but those tend to be high stakes because that's graded. That sort of undermines a lot of the social interaction so that we can combat that sense of isolation, both that Kara had experienced in her first year that was remote, but also that the first case study myself had experienced where I was struggling and there was just like no opportunity to relay that feedback or open up that I was having a hard time in the course. Accessible events and opportunities that are designed for a wide range of people that don't require a particular skill level or having taken a particular course is really important. I think one of the things that really stood out to me about Kara's research experience was viewing her research mentor very much viewed research as part of the educational experience. He had constructed modules for her to learn new skills within Python. He created sort of like very clean data sets for her to practice on before managing the data that their lab was working with. And she felt extremely supported, and like that buy-in set the stage for her to be able to ask a lot of questions. And the last piece, extremely important, is to prepare students for the W curve. We're never going to be able to like completely eliminate the up and down of moving away from home and not knowing anybody and being in hard classes and all the things. But normalizing that progress is nonlinear. We're not taking forward steps every day. There are setbacks all the time. There are challenges all the time. There are moments of intense growth as well. And to offer guidance, but also techniques if you know them, and direction through them. If you're a faculty member teaching a course, that might look like specific study strategies that are more effective for your material, what you might be imagining students are doing to prepare for your assessments. If you're a research mentor, I think one of the challenging pieces is that students are very much conditioned that they have to show you progress. And the reality of research is that progress looks a lot of different ways. And sometimes the result is that, you know, you haven't made the breakthrough finding that you'd hope. The instrumentation doesn't work. These are all new experiences to students. And so this overwhelming feeling that I have to show positive progress, I have to show positive progress, normalizing that that's not the nature of daily research and that's not the nature of daily work, but identifying what's going wrong and addressing it is a fundamental skill that takes us and can be applied to every single facet of our lives, but especially work in the sciences. Major conclusions are that bolstering students' self-perceptions has great potential to increase persistence. Now, bolstering them meaning, what is my interest level? We already assume that courses are designed to do this, which is increase interest and increase skill. But also being cognizant of an increase in what we think our potential is. Specifically connecting students to early research experience has the potential to do that. Structuring on-ramps to research will really require intentional design to reach as many students as possible. The students who are most on top of their email, the students who send you that polished resume, the students who write the note perfect cold email. Not every student can do that. And there are student researchers who may not be able to do that, who would be fantastic and productive and effective members of your teams if you're a researcher. So how can we design on-ramps that are visible to everyone and things that everyone can engage with? Because like writing the perfect email is also a skill, sort of separate from research. And fourth, earlier interventions have greater efficacy. Once someone has left a STEM field, the odds of us being able to bring them back substantially decrease. So the earlier that we're really looking at this, the greater our efficacy will be. Great question in the chat. I did see the red circle. What ways have you found to engage faculty in supporting STEM students? First is I usually talk with faculty who are in first year, like as far as the chronology, first year coursework positions, because they're going to have the largest audience. And start by asking them, what do they think about in terms of conceiving, like, what do they think the goals are of their course? How do they view their course in terms of cultivating one of those 4 levers, right? Interest, skill, talent, potential. I'm not as much into talent as the other 3. And I think the most important thing is to allow faculty the space to share their observations and then begin asking questions about, say they describe a particular aspect of their course, something that they're doing. If it's something that stands out to you as something that can be tweaked to reach more people, there's an inroad there to begin a conversation that says, what stands out to me is that a student might need to be really comfortable with this in order to take advantage of that. Have you thought about sort of like demystifying that for a broader group of students? I think the most important thing is building the relationship with the faculty member, listening to their motivation, their perspective around why they build their class the way they do, and then meeting them within where they're at in terms of that to see sort of like, what are our options? Have you considered this style of assessment? Do you ever experiment with releasing practice materials or talking about practice? There's a really good Iverson joke there that I'm just walking by, but it's okay. Things like that. I think the most important thing is to just engage in regular communication with faculty members about why they're constructing their courses the way they are. What is the purpose and what opportunities do we have to start to open up these courses to more people? I have one last slide, which are sort of what I'm focused on now. What we're noticing post-lockdown is that students are really beginning college without having had critical growth experiences from high school. Right now, our first year, COVID disrupted their sophomore year of high school. And this really deeply impacts their ability to engage across a range of areas. And my big questions have been, can early research generate like a broader engagement boost? Can it help them refocus? A lot of them struggle with feelings of being very overwhelmed, feelings of just not being able to manage what's on their plate. Can that reorientation of their own skill and ability be something that can be leveraged through their other courses and their outside academic sense of belonging? And can research be effectively deployed to support broader skill building, professionalism, creativity, innovation, inquiry? So many of these schools, I mean, we have a real K-12 problem in the United States, which is that there are schools that are funded as if they're colleges that have an endowment of that size in their high schools. And we have schools that are barely making it from year to year. And within a single incoming class, we're serving students from across that spectrum. And so for many students, that year and a half was really a lost year. And then senior year was entirely focused on college applications. So just a huge, huge amount of what we expect students to have grown through in high school is not there in the same way. How can we meet them where they are, but also use these interpersonal moments of inquiry and creativity and investigation and research to help generate both a boost in their engagement within research, but also outside research to build skills across the board. Those are the things that I'm really looking at. So I'm going to stop there. I know I ran way over. I knew that was going to happen. I tried. And
Thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah, thank you. I want to open it up to any questions that people have.
Yes, I think we since it's already 11:40, and we can take like one question, and we will wrap up. So, are there any questions in the audience? If not, how about I have a question. Yeah, I wonder like what out of school activities, extracurricular activities do you think, from your perspective, contribute a lot to the identity?
Especially now, there is an array of opportunities across computer science. And computer science, in terms of learning it on their own, doing it in community and things called like hackathons, where people are problem solving using computer science, especially in high school, but they can continue in college, are great, fertile experiences for collaboration, for conversation, for idea exchange, for destigmatizing being wrong, because like, let's be honest, like most ideas do not work. That's the nature of science, but in K through 12, that doesn't feel like what science is. And so it becomes this like extremely abrupt transition where you go into academic science. Even in coursework, you're suddenly wrong a lot more than you're right. And so any spaces where you're learning applicable skills that can be seen in multiple projects, where you're also exchanging ideas and talking, like never shaming anyone for being wrong, but really taking what they're suggesting and trying to apply it to a new question is extremely valuable. So I really encourage people to experiment with some of these free resources. We have Codecademy, has like a bunch of different languages. What's interesting is like when I'm a bit old, but when I was young and the internet was a thing, there were things called like MySpace and Zanga, and where we kept our journals online. And virtually everyone my age has like a very rough understanding of HTML because we all wanted to decorate our own pages. And just being able to say like, I know how to do this, it doesn't feel like this big barrier when you walk into a class that might be teaching a completely different language, is a wildly different experience than the counterfactual, where you walk in being like, whoa, I've never seen this before. I don't know what's going on. I want it to be perfect. You know, that kind of feeling. Areas of experimentation, of trial and error are extremely, extremely helpful for student identity as they come into their first year.
Yeah, I think I should give audiences more opportunities. There are a few hands up here, and yeah, maybe go from the Angelo. Is that correct to pronounce that way?
Angelo, yeah. Thanks for a really nice talk. I was wondering about there being talent and skill next to each other, and I personally try and discourage myself from thinking so much about talent. I'm wondering, what do you think about trying to discourage people from thinking about talent in general? Is that a good idea? And are there healthy ways to do that?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting, you probably picked up on me being like, this is what students bring in and not what I co-sign. I think, so there's a lot of literature that shows that when students are asked to rank their impressions of fields and where talent is most important, STEM fields are really at the top, whereas other fields have a much more growth mindset orientation in terms of this is my skill level now, but I can get better at it. And talent, which is this notion of like an intrinsic ability, is much less relevant. Some of the things that I encourage people to do, because it's very difficult, it's almost impossible to tell someone, oh, just like stop thinking that. They won't do it. They're like, okay, but I've been doing this for 18 years. I'm gonna keep believing in it. Because a lot of the time these narratives have been positive identity sort of markers for us. I was someone who was told I was a math person, which is like, now I look back on it, it's very laughable, because what I was doing in my spare time was studying mathematics. So like outside of class, I'm like doing all this study. I come in class and like suddenly I can do all these things. And everyone's like, wow, you're such a math person. But it's like, no, I'm doing this for fun. But it didn't even clock for me. What was happening is they're telling me there's a quality about myself that I had nothing to do with, that I was sort of like born with. And then later when things are going to become challenging for everybody at some point. And when that happened, I had no muscles to use to like figure out how to move through it. And my whole sense of myself fell apart because what I believed was, oh, I must be wrong. That must mean that I need to leave. Okay, how do we fix this? How do we adjust this? I start the beginning of my relationship with someone, just sort of like shortly interjecting, I don't love discussing talent. That's such a slippery idea. A lot of people think about it in many different ways. And then whenever there's an opportunity to check in with someone, whenever there's like a period of growth where they're on the other side of learning something, I always sort of like check in and ask them to reflect on that, or at least like state and acknowledge that there has been growth, that, 6 months ago, I had no idea how to do this. What kind of learner were you at the beginning of the year is a lot of the questions that I talked to my first year advisees about, because we're about 8 months out from when they first got here. And now they even will self-reflect and say, you're like a wildly different learner. And I say, oh, do you think like that has to do with your talent? And they're like, no, I like sweated for this. The more that you can repeat this ability to look back on learning with perspective, the more I've found that you can chip away at this notion that talent is that important. It's also really helpful to leverage other aspects of people's identity. For me, I tend to, especially with athletes and people with other physical artists, musicians, dancers, athletes, many of them have a very different understanding of talent within that field than science. Science is still the untouchable intrinsic talent. But when you say, like how much of your ability in playing the oboe, in being a point guard is based on talent, they're like, well, I've done this for 1,000,000 hours. I'm good at it because I've just devoted myself to it. It's like just saying, why don't you think about science that way? And they're just like, huh. So I don't always think of it as like needing to have a conversation where I explain the world as it actually is to people, but just starting to plant seeds of how to reframe the perspective has been my sort of best bet with students. And then eventually, usually the boomerang comes back in like a year and they're like, you know what? I think you might have been right. And I was like, thank you. I don't hear it often, but it is a very tough conversation because we hold on to these ideas very tightly, and it doesn't help that like film and television kind of encourage this notion of what this is like, how this talent exists or what it does. I think there's another
Thanks
question.
a lot.
Yeah, Bobby.
It's Phoebe. First of all, thank you so much. My interest particularly has to do with women's experiences in STEM. And you may know that there's all kinds of research out there showing how male professors tend to call on male students and reinforce their comments more enthusiastically. And what I'm wondering, you spoke about engaging individual professors to try to understand what their goals are and so on. But what I'm wondering is, what do you think the likelihood or the possibility of putting in place some kind of, I don't know, meeting program or some way of communicating with STEM faculty as a group to get across to increase their awareness, particularly again for young women, of the kinds of anxieties and experiences that young women in the majority of these STEM classes often have about entering the STEM field? Is there any chance that there could be a broader effort to engage faculty and increase their awareness of some of the obstacles?
Great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is that right now, almost all of these opportunities to learn about this are very opt-in. And so it becomes kind of like a self-reinforcing, like someone already identifies as a person who wants to improve and thinks they might, I think any instructor, most instructors are aware that there's opportunity for improvement, but it's difficult when it's all opt-in, because often when we're talking about bias that you're discussing, in this particular instance, gender bias, the people who would most benefit from hearing this are least likely to sign up for something like that. I think one of the most powerful things is for individual departments to set it as a prerogative for their group. It's very difficult, especially when you get into like large groups across departments. That level of coordination often is very rare. And so I encourage using groups that already coordinate to do other things, because that structure is already preset. That group of people is used to getting together, to voting on things, to discussing things, often starting with some metrics, like if data is not available, a climate survey is very helpful to get student voice at the center of it, where people are discussing their experience in the department with a full awareness that what the intention of faculty and what the impact of their choices or their conduct in the classroom are often very different. But to frame it as, let's explore whether we are meeting the standards that we set for ourselves, and try to begin having opportunities within that unit, because that unit is already established.
And any optimism about the likelihood of that actually happening on a department level?
Yeah, I absolutely. I would
Good.
say the inroads that astrophysics here has made have been incredible, tremendous in terms of gender and racial parity.
Wonderful.
Really fantastic. And when I asked faculty there, how did you do it? Two of them said, we decided this is what we wanted to do.
Right. Well, you have a prominent woman astrophysicist I'm aware of. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Kate, I think we'll have this one last question, and it's in the chat from Chen, because we are cognizant of the time. Our data here at the SED showed a steady decline in STEM interest before college and a steep decline in the summer between high school graduation and the beginning of college. The freshman year honeymoon compared to the end of high school is a landslide. Do you have a hunch about what happened in the summer before college? And that came from Chen.
Yeah, I think what's really challenging is the experiences that people are having between the end of high school into college. One thing about that senior year of high school is that students are consistently packaging themselves for applications. They are packaging themselves as, I am a biologist, I am a chemist, I am a physicist. And that repetition becomes very rote, but as we all don't know, but in the spring of high school senior year, right, we call it the senior slump. And so there is this like rote repetition of identity, often without other experiences to bolster the identity. And so I find that identity there at the end of college to be uniquely fragile in a way, because there's often sort of like a lack of academic work that might be happening in the classroom. Everyone's super fatigued, teachers too, like I'm aware of it, yes. Going into summer, most students are pre-registering for their courses and are sitting down for the first time to get a real snapshot of what is fall semester. Now that I've said I am going to be a biology major a million times, what's that actually going to look like, right? And they're seeing that for the first time. And that is an unsupported moment as well. Are they seeing it while sitting next to an academic advisor? Are they seeing it while sitting next to someone who's a second year or a third year student? Likely not. They're sitting there looking at it and it's just on a piece of paper, and depending on how they feel about themselves, right? Interest, skill, talent, potential. that list of courses, they're left to grapple and make sense of it on their own. So my hunch about what happens, not to mention like all the helpful family members who come to graduation parties and are like, you're majoring in what? Like that is not helpful either. So what I feel like is happening in high school, which it's not a feeling, what I have spoken with students about when we discuss how their sort of like morphing identities are changing there is that, you know, they've had this emphasis that's coming out of the college application cycle. They haven't felt connected to significant academic work in some time. They feel extremely exhausted. And then they're left in sort of this isolated, alone space of what does it mean to be in these classes? Am I prepared to be in these classes? And they feel like there's a lack of answers, right? Of resources, of people to talk to, of people to ask questions of. And they aren't necessarily the most sophisticated questions, but for someone to just say, here's what a typical first year course load is, and here is what that might look like on a day-to-day basis. Here are some of the resources that you can use. Here are some of the communities that you can be a part of. Here are some of the tutors that you can take advantage of, the help rooms that you can go to. You know, that second piece is so important, but there's sort of like this pause that's like 2 or 3 months where students are just left to really consider, is this what I really want to do, without much connection? And I think that's really what ends up, unfortunately, by the time people walk in. I've definitely had several students where even, you know, here I'm reading these are my top 3 interests. And I'm like, so computer science. And they're like, sociology. And I'm like, okay, we have completely swung out of it. But it's an opportunity for a conversation that I don't think happens very often, because especially with larger institutions with fewer resources that are more often automated, there's often not an opportunity for like a person-to-person experience there to have a conversation and sort of like, you know, address any concerns that the student might have, or identify whether they really are still kind of on the margin and trying to think about their options. So that's my hunch about what's happening in the summer before college. Thank you for that question. That's great.
Wendy, do you want to ask your question? It will be our last one.
Oh, okay. Well, it's not really a question. It's more of a comment. So I'm the administrator of the Science Education Department, and besides these seminars, we have a research group, an active research group, and we mostly recruit master's level students at Harvard to do research with us, some undergraduates if they have the time. And it's always been kind of a really important piece of our department. But we found what improved something really greatly was we had a visiting professor come in, and she sat in on the group, and she gave a suggestion of maybe, you know, maybe having our postdocs in our department be kind of big siblings to the, you know, and mentor or be available and meet regularly with the students to talk, to answer their questions, to be a resource. And we found that was really successful, just kind of the big little sibling, because, you know, sometimes it's a little intimidating to go to the faculty member and ask the question, but if you have someone that's more your, you know, similar, so I don't know, that was just something that we did, and from where I sat, it seemed like there was a lot of satisfaction with that. So.
Yeah, we've seen that across a lot of different components. I think one of the biggest challenges too, as people are transitioning into college, is that, especially, you know, coming from high school, they are on a much more sort of like name basis with a wide range of people who have known them for a really long time. And that just like the floor really drops out of the bottom. One, yes, you're moving, but also the structure and the size of these institutions is so different. And so that interpersonal connection is really, really missing. And we're only talking like, this is like, I don't know, level 2 or level 3 of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like we're pretty close to some of the foundational core stuff that people really need in order to be able to sort of like reach that self-actualization level. And so exactly what you're seeing, we've seen as well. I think one of the challenges as we've worked with pairing students together is, especially as we have sort of like a broader and broader range of students, just like being exceedingly sort of like gentle with the degrees that we find students might be similar, but also coaching some of the big siblings to, ask probing questions, lead with curiosity, not assuming, but always just like asking for clarification. What's your experience like? It's always a struggle, even from my perspective, right? Especially at the beginning, less so now, but not letting my experience lead as far as how I'm interpreting what people are describing their current undergraduate experience as. That's such a great, thank you for sharing that. I'm glad to hear that that's happening.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. Yeah, there's another comment in the chat. I don't want to miss that. Maybe just point
Oh, thank
that
you so
out.
much.
Yeah. Okay. I won't read this. Yeah. I think it's time for me to wrap up. I would like to conclude by thanking Kate for such an informative and inspiring talk. Thank you so much for sharing us with your personal experiences, your perspectives, your interesting, the persistence model, and some practical case studies regarding the STEM identity. And I hope you all find it interesting and significant and something that you can think about in your future practical work, and we will make our seminar available in the SED channel. And thanks everybody for your participation and your engagement. And thank you, Kate, again. And we will look forward to seeing each of you in our next seminar in the fall semester. Thank you so much. Bye.
I'll just add that this is our final seminar, and thank you. And stay tuned. We'll have a new schedule out for the fall and for next year.
Thank you, Cindy.